So, how can illusions satisfy God's Son? That's the question today here on A Course in Miracles. How can illusions satisfy God's Son? How? How is it possible? So this question that I wanted to pose right at the outset here of this video is also the day's idea in the workbook for students, which is lesson 272. All right. 272. How can illusions satisfy God's Son? How can the temporary satisfy God's Son? How can the temporal, right, satisfy God's Son? How can the changing satisfy God's Son? I mean, deeply satisfy, gut level, core level, at our essence. How is it possible? How is it possible that something that's here today, gone tomorrow, for example, right? How is that possible that that can bring lasting peace and happiness, i.e., the peace of God? I'm certain that you're gathering from my line of questioning and the words that are coming out of my mouth that the answer to this is, well, it can't. And that would be right. That would be right, especially when we think of it from the standpoint of who we really are. And I invite you to do that. Think of it from the standpoint of who you really are, the Son of God, in other words, the extension of God, the thought of God. Put it also in context of the Course's famous statement that ideas leave not their source. Source, capital S, in this case. You being the idea, because we are that. Remember, we're not a body. This thing that you see talking to you is here one day, gone the next. Now, I hope that this may last another 40 to 50 years, right, of this lifetime. However, who among us is guaranteed that? Do we really know? This is actually a perfect example of how we live our lives in the world with blinders on, thinking that this thing that isn't even who we are is going to last forever, in utter denial of who we really are, because we're afraid to examine it. And this course, as well as multiple other spiritual traditions in this world today, encourage us to do that examination. In other words, it encourages us to go to the places that scare us. The ego wants to keep you dull, stupefied, and it attempts, at least at first, right, to issue all of this confusion in the guise of safety. It wants to keep you safe from what? From everyone else, from the supposedly outside world that is supposedly your opponent, that's out to maim you, to brutalize you, to wound you, kill you, to damage you economically, to damage you politically, to strip away all of your rights. The list of examples for that can and does go on and on. In the world, we heap one layer of complexity after another upon ourselves, willfully ignorant of the truth of who we really are. And we spend most of our time, if we're honest and we assess it honestly, we're afraid to bring all of these illusions to the truth. We're afraid to look at the light, which is who we are. This course and the practice of forgiveness aims to help us remove that fear by getting out of our own way, by trusting the guidance of the Holy Spirit, by trusting the guidance of Jesus, your guide or guides, your higher self, the universe, God. It doesn't matter how we name this force. You could even call it the force if you wanted to. It means the same thing. It doesn't matter how we label it. It is our destiny to know ourselves. So we're in the process of dropping that fear a bit at a time, moment by moment. This is the essence of spiritual practice, is choosing light in the present moment. That's it, that's all. There's really nothing else to it. Everything else is an appearance of this one choice. Light or dark, love or fear, God or the ego. That's it, that's all. And you, and only you, can make that choice. So feeling in your gut, in your deepest being, who you are. I know that you've done the verbal math, especially if you've been watching these videos. I know that you've done the verbal math and are following along. Who are you? Who am I? I think you know. One with means one with, after all. What else could it possibly mean? And understand that that oneness is not of the body, doesn't have anything to do with it in truth. Now, that doesn't mean here in the world, abandon it to the wind, Netflix and chill, lose your physical health, all of that stuff. It means see things for what they are. Remember, in the last video, we talked about the vision of Christ. So I invite you to take to heart lesson 272. How can illusions possibly satisfy you? And we're not talking about a weekend fling with lots of expensive booze. That's not what we're talking about. So don't get me wrong. It's deep level stuff. Let's face it. I don't know what your spiritual background is, and it really is, it doesn't actually matter what it is. What matters is you're here with an interest in A Course in Miracles, watching this video. That tells me right away that you're serious about this. It tells me that on a deep level, you've had enough of suffering, and that you may have tried multiple different spiritual traditions. You may have tried your hand at multiple different modalities, and you may still be searching for what deeply hits home and resonates with you. A number of people come to the course from that background. So I don't know where you come from, but I do know you mean business. And I thank you for that. I really do. I appreciate that. So I invite you to consider this idea. How can illusions possibly satisfy you? How can the temporary, the temporal, possibly satisfy you? We can choose, and the commentary from lesson 272 makes this perfectly clear, it just spells it out. We can choose heaven instead of hell. This is the choice that we make in the present moment. This is God or the ego, love or fear, our light or our dark, heaven or hell, life or death. That's the choice that we make. And when we can choose one, why would we choose the other when it leads us only to a constant round of suffering? when it leads to dissatisfaction, when it leads to rampant fear, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, right? Addictions, deep sadness, total dissatisfaction with life, dissatisfaction with everyone else, separation, blame, guilt, hatred, anger, war on a larger scale, war. That's the world of the ego. And that's harsh reality, right? It's what we choose when we choose dark and fear. When we choose to see ourselves as separated, as a separate existing being apart from other separately existing beings with inherent self-existence, that's what happens suffering. In Buddhism, they call it samsara, right? The wheel, it's wheel in Sanskrit, literally. It's the round of cyclic existence in which we identify with the ego and repeat our mistakes over and over and over again. Now, whether you are from a tradition that talks about multiple lives, one after the other, whether you even believe in that or not, actually doesn't matter in this context, because you can look at your own experience in this lifetime and see how the hamster wheel operates. Once you get sick of it enough, you formulate the wish to get out of it. And you have. That's what lands you. That's what lands you here. That is why you're interested in A Course in Miracles, isn't it? Because you have had enough on a deep level. So people frequently ask me, and it's a really good question. It's a really good question. What is this process like, and how much time will it take for me to realize my oneness with God, to fully, deeply, truly realize it? In other words, how long does enlightenment take? Yeah. Well, it doesn't take any time at all on one level. Why? There's no time. There's no space. There's no separation of any kind. If there were time, this minute, 9:03 a.m., would be substantially different and independently existing from what we call 9:04 a.m., for example. And then, so no time at all. And then, well, it doesn't matter how much time. That's the other response. The Course teaches us that this is the purpose of time, to allow us to awaken. It's what time is for. And that's a really interesting and beautiful approach to it, isn't it? That is something that I've always found very, very empowering, and perhaps you do too. Time is for us to wake up. We're going to do it. It doesn't matter when, and ultimately there's no time anyway. The Course teaches us, and this is something that appears in several different places in the text, and it's alluded to also here in the workbook, is that all of this has already happened. It's past. We're looking at the past. As soon as the separation appeared to occur, the answer was given. The antidote, if you will, was given, and we all have been restored to our original condition without so much as a blip, with no interruption to the constant flow of love, of God, of which we're a part, one with. Yeah, I do mean that, one with. So when we look at things, we look at the past. And if you want a more concrete empirical example, look at the stars at night. We're literally, when we look at a starry sky, we're literally looking at the past, aren't we? Because in terms of space, and distance, concepts that we've made up, they're so far away, these stars and planets and galaxies, that they may not even be there now, yet their light is still reaching our eyes. It's the past. Same with everything that we look upon. And the Course talks about that in some detail. This is not an idea that is easily grasped sometimes. So, as with anything that I have to say in this video series, if something doesn't sit with you, yeah, that's all right. As always, I invite healthy skepticism. And by healthy, I mean, if you're going to question what the Course says, question the very foundations of all of your existence, of everything you now believe, without holding back. This is where we get into trouble, isn't it? We hold back and we forgive partially, thinking that that somehow qualifies for total forgiveness. It doesn't. In other words, we want to hold grudges against a certain political party. We want to hold certain grudges against a certain person for harm that they may have committed against us in the past or may commit in the future. Neither one's the present moment, is it? We want to keep certain forms of what the Course calls specialness for ourselves. So we know, and the Course confirms this for us, that forgiveness is either total or it's not at all. Love is either total or it's not at all. And of the two choices that we make that I've talked about on this and pretty much every video in this series, one of the choices that we have to make is real, the other is not. So it's up to us to choose the one that's real. So what's in it for you? Full awakening. I mean, you can't tell me that on some level that's not what you want. You can't tell me that on some level that's not what you seek. All that we can do is delay that by contenting ourselves with less than, by contenting ourselves with what is not, with illusions. So I repeat the idea for today, lesson 272, how can illusions satisfy God's Son? I like to throw the word in possibly, and obviously I have multiple times here. How can illusions possibly satisfy God's Son? I invite you to consider that today wholeheartedly. And as always, I invite you, upon considering that, to choose love. And before I go, quick note, I also invite you to be kind to yourself. Really, really critically important. We're our own worst critics. Every single one of us is. I'm my own worst critic. You're your own worst critic. Even if there is somebody who appears to be an adversary or hostile to you, we're still our own worst critics. So when you examine your experience and recognize with crystal clarity all of the times where you chose fear, I invite you to be kind to yourself and do not leave yourself out of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a wish to see things as they are with the vision of Christ. You cannot possibly exclude yourself from this. So in practice, this looks like be kind to yourself. You may have made some horrifically wrong choices in the past, but it remains the past, and you have the present moment right now to choose differently. This is spirituality in general, not just A Course in Miracles, but the spiritual path in general is a message of tremendous empowerment and tremendous hope, because no matter what you've done in the past, you have right now to choose yet again. All right. We'll see you here on the next video, and thank you, as always, for your practice and for joining me.